Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nancy Netzer, inaugural Robert L. and Judith T. Winston Director of the McMullen Museum and Professor of Art History at Boston College. I want to welcome you, members of the McMullen Museum and fans of Martin Parr, to the Preview Day virtual lecture for our exhibition in the Daly Family and Monin Galleries. Martin Parr, Time and Place. The exhibition was to be open today for previews, but alas, the snowstorm has thwarted our plans. I dare say the building doesn't look quite like this right now. It's covered with snow, and we believe that they are plowing us out so that we will be open starting tomorrow morning to vaccinated visitors, and we'll stay open through June 5th. For those of you who won't be able to make it to campus this spring, in a few weeks we'll launch on our website a digital walkthrough of the exhibition. And thanks to our talented and dedicated docents, led by Sharon Bazarian, we'll provide both in-person and docent-led tours of the exhibition. Now, it would be hard to overstate how pleased and privileged the McMullen is to be the first venue in the United States to present a career-encompassing exhibition, more than 135 works, epitomizing Martin Parr's polymathic visionary career as photographer, collector, and chronicler of the history of photography. As all of us engaged in the shaping of this exhibition at Boston College have learned over the past 2.5 years, the deeper one delves into Martin Parr's pioneering contributions to and influence on the history of photography, the more one is rewarded. For providing this opportunity to the McMullen team and Boston College faculty in the art history, and film and Irish studies departments, we have several people to thank. The first is Tracy Marshall Grant, the director, a producer at Northern Narratives in Bristol, England, who at the time we met her in October 2019 had been producing, in collaboration with the Martin Parr Foundation and his studio, an exhibition entitled From the Pope to the Flat White. The exhibition of 88 of Parr's photographs taken in Ireland, beginning in the 1970s, was slated to travel to venues in Limerick, Roscommon, Dublin, and Belfast in 2020 and 2021. And what you see here on the screen is the cover of that exhibition's catalog, which has an excellent introductory essay by the esteemed Irish Times critic, Fintan O'Toole. Envisioning an American venue for the exhibition, Marshall Grant contacted Parr's and her longstanding friend, the renowned photographer from the Isle of Man, and for many years, a professor at Harvard, Chris Killip. She asked for suggestions for a suitable venue in the US. Chris Killip's first response was to contact Boston College professor of photography, Karl Baden, about the possibility of the McMullens mounting the exhibition, and to put Baden in touch with Tracy Marshall Grant. Professor Baden called me immediately to talk about his ideas to expand the exhibition beyond the core of Irish photographs in order to tell a broader, more comprehensive story of Parr's projects over the past 5 decades. The McMullen team had no doubt that Marshall Grant's offer presented an outstanding opportunity to show an American audience for the first time the multiple contributions of one of the most influential and prolific documentary photographers of his generation. So that is how this project came to be. Sadly, Chris Killip died in 2020, but we're honored to have his wife, Mary Halpenny Killip, attending today as we thank Chris publicly and dedicate this exhibition to his memory. We owe great debts of gratitude to Karl Baden for curating the exhibition at the McMullen, and to Tracy Marshall Grant for producing and sharing the Irish exhibition and helping us expand it with additional photographs. Of course, none of this would have been possible without Martin Parr himself and the generous loans from his studio. To choose additional works and organize the photographs into thematic groupings and shape the narrative of the larger exhibition to be presented in a country unfamiliar with the locales and subjects of most of the images. The McMullen and Karl Baden as curator were fortunate to be able to call on the expertise of faculty colleagues as curatorial collaborators. We're grateful to Professors Ash Anderson and Kevin Lotery from Art History, Jane Cassidy, Lisa Kessler, and Greer Muldowney from Studio Art, and Guy Viner, Marjorie Howes, Vera Kreilkamp, Joe Nugent, Rob Savage, and Jim Smith from Irish Studies. In addition, Professors Howes and Kreilkamp took on the task of writing the texts and labels for the Irish photographs, as they have for many of our previous exhibitions focusing on Ireland. Professors Baden, Anderson, and Lotery drafted all the others. Alexander Parkin Smith produced the videos accompanying the exhibition. In conjunction with a robust lineup of courses, lectures, and other public programs that we're offering in collaboration with the Art History and Film and Irish Studies departments, including a Lowell lecture by Martin Parr on May 2nd. The exhibition aims to engage our campus and the broader community in conversations focused on Martin Parr's pivotal influence over the past 5 decades on the development and chronicling of documentary photography throughout the globe. I invite you all to click on the events menu option on our McMullen website for a list of the virtual and in-person programs we have organized to enhance the exhibition and for which you're all welcome to register. For digital printing of the photographs, we owe a debt of gratitude to Mike Hale, Charlotte King, and Louis Little at the Martin Parr Studio, and Professor Greer Muldowney of our art department. The McMullen's assistant director, John McCoy, designed the exhibition didactics, website, and edited the videos. Manager of exhibitions and publications, Kate Schugert, oversaw organization of the exhibition and editing of the didactics. Assistant director, Diana Larson, designed the installation brilliantly to present the photographs to their best advantage and to establish provocative thematic juxtapositions. Rachel Chamberlain, manager of education, outreach, and digital resources, has created an array of public programs to enhance dialogue with the exhibition. As always, the museum extends special thanks for the ongoing support of those who make our exhibitions possible: the administration of Boston College and the McMullen Family Foundation. We especially thank Jacqueline McMullen, President Leahy, Provost Quigley, and Dean Kalsher. Major support for the exhibition was provided by the Parr Foundation, the patrons of the McMullen Museum, chaired by Mike Daly, and Marianne and Vincent Q. Giafuni. And now it's my privilege and pleasure to introduce today's lecturer, the curator of the exhibition, and an esteemed photographer and professor of photography at Boston College for more than 3 decades, Karl Baden. Professor Baden's lecture will run about 50 minutes, and then he will take questions which you are welcome to put in the Q&A. So now please join me in congratulating Professor Baden on the exhibition as he takes over the screen.
Hello. I am going to share my screen here. Okay. Presenter. Do we see that? Are we good? Okay, great.
Yes, Carl, but we can also see your notes.
Oh, okay. I know I did the wrong thing. Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate
No
it.
problem.
Play from start. There we go. Okay. So, before I begin, a few brief comments. First, in terms of Martin Parr's work, there's a lot of meat on these bones, and one may approach the picture from multiple contexts: formal, historical, cultural, socioeconomic, and on and on. What I'll talk about today, while trying to give a general understanding, is really just a small part of the elephant. So, for example, I may know less about Ireland than many of you in the audience. And while I may occasionally make an obvious point, say about the history or politics of Ireland, I'll leave all that expertise to the wonderful folks in the Irish Studies Department, who I believe will be making a presentation on the 28th of February. Second, most of the photos I'll show in the next hour are in our exhibition, but there are a few, especially at the beginning, that I've thrown in to reinforce a point, but they're not part of the show. Which ones they are should be obvious to most of you most of the time, I guess. But if they are photographs by Martin Parr and not in the show, I will try to remember to let you know. Third, this exhibition would not have happened were the idea not planted in my head by the late, great Chris Killip, who about 2 years ago asked me if Boston College might be interested in showing his friend Martin Parr's photographs from Ireland. We ended up doing just that, and then some, so that what we have finally are photographs from 5 bodies of work, plus books, making this, if I'm not mistaken, the largest survey of Parr's Parr's work in the US to date. We at the museum and at Martin Parr's studio and foundation dedicate this show to Chris. So off we go. And we may as well start with a look at Martin Parr, the man, the myth. Actually, that was a little fiction of Parr in one of his auto portraits, a wall of which you will encounter in the first gallery if you view the show the way you're supposed to view the show. Okay. To begin with, I'll say that I've had a familiarity with Martin Parr's photography for a long time. He and I are the same age, and although he began taking pictures at a much earlier age than me, I think we've both been aware of the world of art and photography for roughly the same length of time. But it wasn't until I began working on this exhibition that I began to realize how much more the quote idea, as it were, of Martin Parr, which is to say his overall vision, transcends documentary photography and really addresses the world we live in. It also addresses how we choose to spend our time, what we think is worth celebrating, and the way we may look at others and be looked at by others superficially unlike who we are, whoever we are. So this is Parr near the start of his photographic career. I guess it was the early to mid 70s. Since I can remember back that far, I'd like to briefly set the scene from what I was aware of England at that time in terms of who may have been the more known, if traditional, British influences for someone in their 20s starting out in photography. Aside from well-known portrait and fashion photographers like Cecil Beaton on the left and David Bailey on the right, there was Bill Brandt, seen here in this 1966 self-portrait, a giant monolith in terms of modernist British photography. He himself was highly influenced by surrealism. You may be able to glean a little bit of that by looking at this picture, but he also documented English life and was certainly class conscious. Whether you loved him or hated him, it was hard not to be influenced. A more contemporary influence was this gentleman, Tony Ray Jones, 11 years older than Parr, an extremely talented photographer. Unfortunately, he died young, age 30, but even in a relatively brief time, produced a terrific body of work. This photograph from 1967 was on the cover of Ray Jones's first book called A Day Off, published posthumously. And here's a Martin Parr photo made in 1975. Parr himself, I believe, claims Ray Jones as an influence. Of course, all artists are influenced by their peers, and Parr was one of a number of social documentary photographers who hung out and fed off each other in those days. And it would have been hard to have been a photographer, even in the UK, without feeling the influence of some American photographers from the 50s and 60s. It's only the lack of time that prevents me from showing examples of their work. I apologize. I do, however, feel the need to mention another much less obvious but possible influence, the artist Richard Hamilton. I guess primarily a painter, but he also worked in photography. He was a proto-pop artist whose best known piece, this collage from 1952, let's see, it's titled, "Just What Is It That Makes Today's Homes So Different, So Appealing?" Predated the American pop movement. And I show it here because it's a home interior and a comment on lifestyle, consumption, and desire. And here, some of Parr's earliest work, a home interior while still a student at Manchester Polytechnic, the installation Home Sweet Home from 1973. To me, it indicates an awareness of conceptually based art, perhaps surprising to those who know his work now, but still indicative of a strong sense of place and an awareness of class. right down to the very wallpaper. And by the way, Parr would collect later old samples of wallpaper that would have otherwise been trashed by the shops, eventually donating the collection to the Victoria and Albert Museum. And by the way, I will address some of his many collections at the end of this talk. Okay. While this is the first image in the Irish section of our exhibition, it's called O'Connell Bridge in Dublin. I think it's a bit of an outlier in terms of referencing Ireland specifically, and I was made aware of it in another body of work a while back called Bad Weather. I think I showed this yesterday, which was published as a small book in 1982. I believe this is Parr's first offset printed book. Now, the British Isles, of course, are known for dismal weather, and Parr, in typically perverse fashion, took it on as a challenge. Often using a strobe, which in this case captured precipitation, Bad Weather is the first of Parr's work that I knew as a cohesive group. Now, this image is not in the show, too bad, because I've always loved its visual randomness and unbeautiful beauty, I guess. There's no real central subject. Every part of the picture is equal to every other part. Okay, from the Pope to a flat white, Parr's photographs from Ireland over a 40-year period is the most extensive body of work on display here, and it forms the core of our exhibition. It begins with Pope John Paul II's visit to Ireland, part of a 1979 world tour. This holds an additional personal interest for me, as I saw and took pictures also when the Pope stopped in Philadelphia just days after Parr's picture was taken. Even in the late 1970s, Ireland was a country that in some ways was still in the 19th century. You know, horse-drawn carts were not unusual, and out in the countryside, some people still occupied thatched cottage roofs. The country, as we know, was fiercely religious, with all the paradox and contradiction that can entail. Abortion and homosexuality were illegal. This is St. Mary's Holy Well in County Leitrim from 1981. Please excuse any mispronunciations in advance. I know I look Irish, but I'm not. This is climbing Crag Patrick, Ireland's most important pilgrimage from 1983. I showed this one yesterday. I think, good photographers are mindful, I believe, to the point where it becomes second nature of how the pictorial elements are organized within the frame of the camera viewfinder. And they often have to do it in a fraction of a second. So here the frame is divided horizontally left to right into three sections. The black and white dog on the left, the boys in the phone booth, one of whose breath is condensing on the glass, and the black and white cows on the right. Now, this juxtaposition of seemingly unrelated elements, I mean, why is a herd of cattle on the street? It may not have been unusual for a county fair in 1982 Ireland, but to a viewer unfamiliar with the culture, the picture presents itself as a surrealist question only the imagination can speculate on. Photographing in this way means being quick and sensitive to gesture. I know that Marjorie mentioned this picture yesterday, I want to add, as the sheep here form a more or less evenly spaced white horizontal wedge across this image, the dark silhouetted figures here are spaced across the picture plane, balancing the image and framing that beautifully rendered horse and rider right out of Edward Muybridge. Of course, it's easy to dissect a photograph when you're looking at it and have the luxury of time. Taking pictures out in the world, however, it's all you can do to respond intuitively and quickly. As they say, F8 and be there. So as you'll see when you come to the museum, Parr's Irish work is itself divided into subsections. This and the next three photos are in the section titled Show Bands and Dance Halls, which documents weekend evening social life of young people. So as folk mill outside or in front of the entrance to the Mayflower Ballroom here, Parr sets his camera for a long exposure, at least several seconds, turning the crowd into a ghostly mass and at the same time suggesting activity. Inside, people passing, checking each other out, the meat market. There's a lot of social comment packed into this image. Parr's use of a flash coupled with a slightly slow shutter speed causes the picture to be both razor sharp and a bit blurred around the edges of the faces. You can also see the movement in the light trails above people's heads. Primping in the bathroom mirror. This one is priceless. Okay, a typology is a group of similar things. And whether or not Parr cares about labels like this, he may be seen as a typologist. He's creating subcategories within a larger body of work. In this subcategory, abandoned Morris miners, he'd go out of his way to find these low-priced British cars, broken down and gutted and left to rot surreally and sometimes beautifully in the countryside. An Irish studio arts faculty here told me, well, they don't have junkyards in Ireland, so they just push the cars out into the fields and the marshes. I have to say, I love the poignancy, the absurdity, and the poetry of these pictures. Now, moving on to the idea of where people live. The title of this is Abandoned Croft near Hamilton County, Leitrim, 1983. It's a picture that could have been taken in 1883 and nothing would have been different. But things move on. And here we have a conflation of the past and present, made in the same year, the bricklayer working on a modern house, hauling his bricks in a donkey-drawn cart. Well, the theme of this one apparently comes from the myth of the American West, the high chaparral, complete with horned cow skull. Notice the motorboat next to the house. Something that I see in this picture is the visual commentary on the photographic conceit of the frame. In this case, a frame within a frame. This is something that Parr does very well. These are show homes, and I don't know, the concept of show homes is not unusual in most areas of the US, although it may have been less common in Dublin in 1986. But what I love about this image is, once again, Parr's awareness of the frame. In this case, how the house across the street fits snugly into the window frame as if we were in a theater waiting for a play to begin, and the curtains have just parted to reveal a set that includes a house facade. Notice also the color, which is neither primary nor saturated. In fact, it's a rather drab and unremarkable, except that the inside of the room and the outside of the house across the street are a virtual match. Martin Parr in 1974, picture taken by the photographer Jeff Howard. This was right before Ireland. Note the small camera there. I'm not sure, but it looks to me like a Leica MP, but it may be a different model. But Leicas were the precision-made, relatively expensive 35mm rangefinder cameras that were standard equipment for any self-respecting social documentary photographer. Now, around 1983, Parr began to use a different camera and larger color film for a project at the beach resort of New Brighton, England. We'll see this work soon, but this camera, the Plabel Machina, shoots film that is more than twice the size of the 35mm film used with the Leica. So for purposes of comparison, on the left, that's your standard 35mm black and white negative. And on the right, a color negative in the larger 6x7 centimeter or 2¼ by 2¾ inch format. Bottom line, the larger film results in a sharper, more detailed image. Of course, you can't see any difference from the slide, but you will when you see the prints on the walls of the McMullen, and I urge you to look at them closely. So Parr, I'm sure, kept his ear to the ground in terms of what other photographers were doing, both in Europe and the US. And I believe his switch to color was in part based on seeing the work of American photographers like William Eggleston, Stephen Shore, and Helen Levitt, who were photographing in color beginning in the 1970s. Something else that happened, perhaps in the 80s, or possibly when he made the switch later to digital, was that he got in closer to the subject, sometimes a lot closer. What's interesting to me about this photo is that, except for the toy, horse, and carriage, the nominal, quote, subjects of the picture have been truncated or cut off. This may allow us to realize that a photograph is to put a frame around a tiny bit of the world, and by extension, that there's life and subject matter that exists outside that frame. And because the subject matter becomes so minimal here, we are compelled to answer the question of the photograph with an answer out of our own imagination. Parr makes us think more by showing us less. So here again, Parr focuses in close. Beyond the balding pate and the half-hearted comb over here of the man in the foreground, the image loses focus, but not so much that we can't tell what's going on. There's a horse with the number 5 on its saddle, so we can surmise that this is a crowd at a racetrack, which the title, Galway Races 1997, confirms. So despite the limited focus, the brightness and saturation of the colors are such that the space in the photo doesn't recede but stays even across the surface, so that all the parts of the image are equally present. This is something that Parr does quite well. And perhaps the next slide, which is not part of the show, the title is West Bay, Dorset, 1997, same year, can illustrate this balancing of light. In this case, he's using a flash to illuminate the foreground, which is the woman on the right. And that comes across very clear and sharp. The background is out of focus, but the overall effect is right up to the surface of the photograph. Now this picture, also close in, which by the way, is a mural-sized print that we have, and you will be able to see it from the outside of the museum entrance, along with the next two, which are not mural-sized prints, but I grouped them together. These are close-up portraits of relatively anonymous individuals that may be seen as addressing the notion of Irish stereotypes. Now, I feel Parr is aware of this, and aside from their, I don't know, compelling minimalist formal strength, these are meta commentary on the idea of the cultural stereotype and of how little can be revealed and still tie the picture to a particular culture. Interestingly, all of these photos were made in the same year, and two of them in the same place. Kinamana, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. But this may tell us less about Ireland than about how Parr was seeing at the time. Now, they're all in the Irish book and in the Irish show, but I think they were first published, or I first saw them in his 1999 book, Common Sense. So here we are in the Crazy Prices supermarket, Dublin, 1986. Seems to me that one strong and ongoing interest of Parr's is commerce, economies, and their effect on populations and class structure, particularly the places where people buy and sell, or, and I'm borrowing here the title of another of his series from the late 1980s, Point of Sale, the point of sale. This photograph was also made in Dublin in 1986, by which time the McDonald's Corporation had long succeeded, I imagine, in dominating the world. And the man in this picture has presumably got out of his truck to order a Big Mac, maybe large fries, a Coke. But what I personally love about this picture is that it makes me think that he's never before encountered a box that listens and talks, and he's trying to figure it out. Also, the color in the photo, it's subtle, but look at how the yellow travels left to right from the truck to the top of the sweater to the order box to the car on the right edge. Another commerce venue is the open air market. This one in Ballymun, an outer suburb of Dublin. Sorry about that. The color here is also low key. The rolled up rugs transitioning from a muddy brown to red, and then back to earth tones, while they have these column-like shapes that are echoed in the vertical towers of the housing project in the background. A bus tour of the Parliament buildings in Belfast, Northern Ireland, taken in 2008. Now, superficially, the picture doesn't give us a lot of information, although the building, just barely in focus, certainly looks official. but the carefully coiffed hairdo compels at least my imagination not only to visualize a face for the person, but maybe to imagine makeup, maybe social class, economic status, perhaps even political persuasion. Once again, Parr forces us to think more by showing us less. Parr's Irish work is an important document in many ways, not least of which in how it chronicles religious and socioeconomic changes in Ireland over the past 4 decades. But it's not news photography, and it doesn't cover every event. So this picture, which shows tourists in Belfast near a mural of the hunger striker, member of parliament, and martyr Bobby Sands, is the closest the work comes, in my mind, to explicitly referencing the Troubles, which as much as any other issue defined 20th century Ireland. Another real defining change occurring in Ireland, particularly in Dublin, coincided roughly with the arrival of the new millennium. The low corporate tax rate, plus the tax credits for research and development, led big firms like, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Meta, aka Facebook, to set up centers in the city. And here, perhaps the ultimate document of how Ireland has changed. Barbara and Maeve's wedding, 2019. I mean, it may not be Gaelic, but as we say where I come from, who'da thunk? But even in modern Ireland, the past coexists with the present. And now that the country is one of the world's tax havens, it may not be unusual. And I was crushed yesterday when Marjorie probably correctly saw those as ferry boats. I saw them as mega yachts lined up at the dock, while the horse and cart is now a diversion for tourists. That's the last slide that I have to show in the Irish part of the exhibition. I want to move on here to something else. Okay, so this photo and the two that follow, I think, are among Parr's earliest in the show. They date from 1976 and 79, which was the year of Parr's photographing the Pope's visit to Ireland. But they weren't made in Ireland. They were made in New Brighton, which is a seaside resort across the Mersey River from Liverpool, England. Of course, we all know Liverpool because of the Beatles, and Parr lived there in the late 1970s. I see these black and white New Brighton pictures as transitional and important because they're a precursor to Parr's most notorious body of work, The Last Resort. New Brighton, the way I understand it, was once a middle-class beach resort, but had fallen on hard times during Margaret Thatcher's term as Prime Minister and became a destination for the working class. It also had fallen into disrepair. And, if you think about the beach, stereotypically, the beach is a place where one goes for, as they say in Britain, holiday. Leave the city behind, reacquaint yourself with nature. Perhaps in Britain, it was also a setting for a pre-Raphaelite drama or romance historically, but still, it's nature. And despite the open space of this photograph, the canvas of the sea and sky, Parr's beachgoers seem anything but calm. And I think here, Parr's sense of composition begins to change slightly, with various humans and animals looking left and right. He starts to freeze chaos. So in 1983, along with his friend Tom Wood, Parr began photographing in New Brighton using medium format color film and much of the time a flash on the camera, which balanced the light values between the foreground and the background. So with screaming babies, stressed out parents, overcrowding, and windblown trash, well, to use a local comparison, this was not Plum Island, this was Revere Beach. Nobody here seems like a happy camper, but hey, that's life, right? I mean, I grew up in a beach town, and I find this totally familiar. Images like this describe chaos and still manage to hold on to a kind of beauty. Look, and I don't know if you can see my cursor, but look at the arm shapes moving left to right across the image. It's Renaissance composition in the blink of an eye. And even in the quieter moments, there's a sense of alienation. This photo reminds me of the photographer Robert Frank, to whom many own a debt. Also from The Last Resort. But Parr includes this picture in another series, another typology called Bored Couples. We've all had the experience of sitting with a partner or spouse or good friend, and there's nothing to say, but no pressure to force conversation. This is the cover of Couples, published in 1992. And Martin Parr has never been above taking a shot at himself. So this bored couple is Martin and Susie Parr. Not surprisingly, The Last Resort, well, let's just say the reaction of the British public and the British media did contain some hostility. There was accusation that Parr's pictures were demeaning to their subjects. In retrospect, though, some think this series has proven to be an insightful window not only into Britain's recent past, but it's an early example of Parr's preoccupation with the economics of class. But all the brouhaha over the work also pushed Parr, ironically, in terms of notoriety anyway, out from the pack of the photographers which he was always grouped in. And for the first time, he became quite well known, if notorious, and sought after. In any case, The Last Resort, here's the cover of one edition of the book, brought Parr a lot of well-paying magazine editorial and eventually even some fashion work, which allowed him to travel to other parts of Europe, and eventually around the globe. And when he finished his job, he'd go out and make photographs for himself, which would eventually become part of exhibitions and books. Meanwhile, back in the UK, Parr's next published body of work after The Last Resort was The Cost of Living, which interestingly began as a BBC television project. Now, I don't know what Parr's relationship was with the producers, but he came out of it with this book. The cost of living examines the newly moneyed or newly more moneyed English middle class at the height of Thatcherism. The images in the book were made between 1986 and 1989. And Parr's photographs here take no prisoners. The caricature is worthy of someone like Hogarth. From the beautifully captured peck on the cheek, to the wine glasses, to the yacht club / Union Jack look of the woman's neckerchief or scarf. Don't know exactly what you call it. Wedding preparations here in Bath, England. And I want to call your attention, of course, to a photograph I recently showed you, because if you look at this picture and look at the choreography of gestures and arms going horizontally across the picture plane, it's just like that one back, and I don't want to go back too far here, there in Brighton Beach. Had to show you that comparison there. I want you to take a look at this one. It's really, it's called the Royal Commonwealth Society, Function for a Summer Evening. It's taken in Bristol, and it always just shocks me. I mean, in the end, a photograph can only tell us what's in the photograph. Its, quote, meaning is assigned by the viewer. I didn't attend this party, so I can't tell you about the conversation depicted here, but I find myself stunned, I mean, wordless, by what I can only describe as the superior and patronizing expressions on the faces of the white couple on the left. Now, my impression may or may not be correct. After all, the photograph was taken in a fraction of a second. The next frame may have shown everyone hugging. But the fact is that Parr chose this image over others to print and publish. And like others in this series, it speaks volumes about race, class, and polite tolerance. Here's another example. I can't say for sure what relationship exists between the two women in this photograph, but to me, they're mother and daughter, and the simultaneous gesture of each woman's hand, one's palm is upturned, the other is reaching into her purse, certainly creates an uncannily seamless comment about the generation gap. The two figures, I think, are also connected by the rusty red-brown color of both pocketbook and the mohawk hairdo. The title is Conservative Midsummer Madness Party, also in Bath. This was used for the cover of the catalog for what I thought was a kind of landmark exhibition, British photography in the Thatcher years. I think it was 1991, curated by Susan Kismaric at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Five photographers from the British Isles were featured. And I did say landmark because it was the first major exhibition at that institution that described the devastating effects that a country's economic policies had on their working class. Now, for any wise guy out there in the audience, I do know about the bitter years at MoMA. I still think this is the first. Again, I apologize for not having enough time for examples of work from all of these outstanding photographers. But meanwhile, Parr continued to travel, obsessively working on project after project. And when he had enough images to make what he felt was a cogent photographic statement, he'd publish another book from another city. And by the way, he's very aware of the selfie. This book, Death by Selfie, is from 2019. Small World, published in 1995, is a kind of wink and a nod at travel and global tourism, and by implication, poses the question of why we go to these places. Images from this series, as well as the cost of living, are hung in the gallery on the museum's second floor at the very end. This was published in 1995. Dowie Lewis, I think, was the publisher. Now, most people who visit the Parthenon, in this case, will come as close as they are allowed to the edifice, looking knowingly or in wonder at the architecture and the friezes, and taking pictures of the same. They'll often take a selfie, or as here, pose in a shot with the rest of their tour group. Photography before Photoshop was good at declaring, "I was here." Parr, on the other hand, does something almost head-smackingly simple. He takes a step, sometimes several steps, back to include the site itself, the tourists surrounding it, and perhaps, as in this case, a photographer taking the obligatory snapshot. This situates the site within a crucial context. It no longer exists on its own. Notice also how the two groups of tourists bunch in repeating vertical shapes that also echo the Parthenon's columns. Of course, this picture is hilarious. It's a riot. It also tells us that these days, we all know, all of us know, that a photograph collapses a three-dimensional world into two dimensions. No doubt many of you have been in Pisa and seen this with your very own eyes. Parr not only steps back here, but he shifts over to literally foreground the repeating gestural pantomime of the tourists. The ancient enigmatic Sphinx and the punk-inspired fashion house Boy of London. Again, he's behind the tourist, viewing the viewer. Parr didn't invent this perspective, and he isn't the only one who does it, but he does it so well. Now, this place is called the Ocean Dome in Mizuyaki, Japan. Japan is an island nation surrounded by water. Actually, I think I see Jim Carrey down there filming a sequel to The Truman Show. See him? Well, I'd be scratching my head more if I didn't know that we have places like this in the US too. And this place certainly is worth a photograph in and of itself. But I'd like to add that there are sometimes sort of templates that artists carry unconsciously in their heads, and they resurface once in a while, I guess. Parr made this picture at one of the hangouts of his youth, Butlin's holiday camp in 1972. This picture is not in the show, but several from Butlin's are. Okay, cover of first Auto Portraits book by Parr. Now, auto portraits may be seen as self-portraits. They were taken by someone else, but Parr commissioned them. And while traveling, he'd be in a city, in this case, Benidorm, Spain, and he might come by a local itinerant photographer or a portrait photo studio, especially for tourists, to have their portraits made. And the photographer would have a set of props, or better yet, a computer with Photoshop. And Parr, the photographer, or both of them, would choose a particular background. This is from Dubai. And that background or setup would usually conform to the photographer's idea of how he or she or they might think a tourist visiting their country might want to be represented. This is in Jamaica in 1997. Parr's poker-faced visage is the one constant in all the auto portraits, no matter the country or the background, deadpan like Charlie Chaplin's Little Tramp. And if Putin doesn't invade Ukraine, maybe Parr will. We'll be back. Now, I've heard some say that this work is an outlier in Parr's corpus, but I disagree. Despite the fact that the camera has been turned about face, he's referencing global culture and tourism. Parr's Charlie Chaplin Everyman may be the nominal subject, but think about it. What's the real subject? It's the culture. Open the pod doors, Hal. I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do it. Auto portraits are displayed in a salon-style hanging. Our curator extraordinaire, Diana Larson, searched high and low for the cheesiest frame she could find. If you start on the third floor like you're supposed to, the auto portraits will be on your left, just as you walk into the gallery. Here's another view. Okay, this picture is not in the show. It's titled Surrey Bird Club, Surrey, England, and it's early work. Parr made it in 1972. I included here because Martin Parr was a bird watcher when he was younger. And as those twitchers among you know, bird watching is a form of collecting, as, by the way, photography can be. But Martin Parr has been a collector most of his life, and as a photographer over the years, assembled the most comprehensive and definitive, among other things, collection of photography books in private hands. Or photo books, one word, as he has taught the world to call them. Seriously, I have always said photography books, and now I say photo books. I never heard it said before Parr's books came out, so I attribute it to him. It was a collection of 12,000 plus volumes. The next step was to put together a book or series of books resourcing his collection. Now, this book, or books like this, they'd been published before, and really recently too, perhaps most notably, the Book of 101 Books, published in 2001. And while the authors of this book updated a few books that had not been previously in the canon, for example, Bill Burke's I Want to Take Picture, or Evidence by Mike Mandel and Larry Sultan, most of the selections were already known and limited to the US and Western Europe. In 2004, Parr, along with his colleague, the writer Jerry Badger, published the photo book, A History, Volume 1. Now, the difference between this book and the ones that came before was that the photo book began to expand its selections to the rest of the world, as did the two volumes that followed. Parr in his travels would visit bookstores and follow leads in Africa, South America, and the subcontinent of Asia, wherever, discovering and cataloging books that were little known or even unknown by the Western-centric photo world. This 3-volume set and the Chinese photo book, published by Aperture in 2015, are without argument, I think, the definitive texts on the subject. It would be difficult to overestimate their importance. What Parr did and continues to do with the photo book histories is essentially he opened the world to the rest of the world. Think about it. I'd like to finish with about 10 more slides of some of Parr's other collections, no less important, and I could go on forever, but I don't imagine you can. First, postcards. The vernacular postcard came along with photography itself. Parr has been collecting them forever. The first book published on this collection was The Actual Boot, 1986. These are postcards from the early 20th century that were photographic, i.e. not made by a printing press. They are of places, events, like the actual boot of the man who was struck by lightning, complete with annotation here, tattooed people, giant vegetables. The actual boot was followed a dozen years later by between 3 and 5 books entitled Boring Postcards. And to many of us, yes, they are boring. I mean, why would someone stopping in a rest area at the A1 motorway or the Jersey Turnpike pay money for a picture of the road? I mean, who would they send it to? And yet, as many artists know, look at Ed Ruscha, there is a beauty and even wonder in the seemingly mundane. Perhaps it may be viewed as a pictorial equivalent of Zen Buddhist practice. Photographers have been influenced by postcards and other images of the mundane going back to Walker Evans. And as the photographer Gary Winogrand famously said, there is nothing so mysterious as a fact clearly described. And whatever the reason for their making, some of these cards are too strange to ever be boring. Finally, Parr collects the memorabilia that is manufactured around political figures and the events that cultures celebrate, especially in Great Britain. To memorabilia from the space race, especially Sputnik dogs. And some of these collections are published as well. And we have a number of the books in the first part or third floor of the show. A book documenting Parr's collection of Saddam Hussein watches. Like his photographs, these collections reference various cultures and what the populations of these cultures see as worthy of celebration and, importantly, as worthy of export. Notice the watch on the lower right, must be after he was captured. Final slide. There is so much to dig into with Parr. In the past couple of decades, some have taken to referring to his corpus of work as Parr World. Frankly, I wouldn't be surprised to learn that even he had no idea of what he was putting together until it started to take shape in front of him. I hope I've given you an idea of the breadth and complexity of Martin Parr's vision, going beyond documentary photography and even photography itself, ultimately engaging nothing less than the world and the desires and schemes of those of us who happen to live in it. I guess that's about all I have to say. Thank you very much. Do I reshare my,
Well, thank you, Carl, for
am I
that.
back? Am I back? Yeah?
Yep, you're back.
Okay.
You're on the screen here. Thank you for that really captivating and insightful and very clear, especially for those of us who are not so familiar with the technology of photography. Introduction to Martin Parr's development and his groundbreaking contributions as a social documentary photographer. I can see why he has been one of your heroes for so many years. And I thank you again for bringing this opportunity to the McMullen to share with the New England audience and really the whole American audience. We do have some questions here, and I'll start in the chat. Let me have a look. Here we are.
I see one on my, I see one on my Zoom. Do you want me to try and answer it?
Sure.
Okay.
Do that.
So are those larger negatives 6x7 you showed early in your lecture also called ectochromes, and is Parr still using film here or there or exclusively digital? Thanks. Okay, so those larger negatives are not ectochromes. It's semantic. Anything that in Kodak language anyway, anything that ends in chrome is a slide, and anything that is a negative, at least in color, ends in color. So Kodacolor or Ectacolor would be negative film, and Kodachrome or Ectachrome would be slide film. Whether Martin is still using digital or using it exclusively, the truth is, I don't know, but my guess would be that for a while now, he's probably been exclusively photographing in digital. You'd have to hear from him himself, but I don't know the answer to that. That's my guess.
So Sharon Bazarian is asking you, I think it's about the auto portraits.
Okay.
She's asking about whether they were all photoshopped.
Okay. Again, I was not there, but let's take a look here. I just want to, actually, let me get out of here. Some of them were clearly photoshopped, okay? And some of them were clearly not photoshopped, let's say. Let's go to auto portraits. Can you see me scrolling here?
No.
Oh, all right. Yeah. Okay. So, I am just going to switch sort of back and forth here. I think that, sorry. Darn it. Lost my slide. I think that a picture like this probably was not photoshopped. Okay. I think he stuck his head through a hole. And I think that a photograph like this, making that mistake. I think that a photograph like this, the next one, probably definitely was photoshopped. Okay. So, and I think it probably has a lot to do. Oh, I'm not sharing my screen again. Please let me know.
No, we can see it.
Oh, okay, good. So I think it also has to do with when it was taken. Probably the earlier ones were not photoshopped for the most part. And as Photoshop began to spread throughout the world and more photographers got it, I'm sure everybody was just totally happy that they would be able to just bunch everything that they thought was important or interesting or funny about their culture, or that that people would ways in people in which people would like to be represented. They'd stuff all of that in their picture. How many planes do you want? 1, 2, or 3? We can do 10 planes. Okay, so what's next?
Another question here from Nina Schneider. She wants to know if you knew if there was any hostility to Parr's portraits in Ireland.
I don't know for sure. Okay. A lot of these things, I would have had to have been there or have had to have extensive talks with Martin. And I do have to say, I have met Martin 3 or 4 times, but we've never had a really extended conversation. My sense is that it seems to me, looking at the Irish pictures, that he integrated himself as much within the population as he could. So he was a known and sort of considered benign presence taking the pictures. He may have encountered hostility from some people. I know, for example, that Chris Killip also took pictures on that pilgrimage on Croagh Patrick. And he told me that after a while, people were telling him to go away. And so I don't know about Martin, but I do know that once The Last Resort had been published, I was having lunch with Chris at one point, and I'm a street photographer, and I've had plenty of experience with people screaming at me, and I was moaning to Chris about it, and he said, "Well, if you were Martin Parr, you wouldn't have any of these problems because you'd be famous. You'd go on the beach, and Martin Parr would say." And the people would say, "Oh, Martin Parr, he's been on the telly," and so that would legitimize you. But Martin would have to answer this for sure. But my guess is that I'm sure he ran into things, but that by and large he probably did not encounter that much hostility. I mean, in before the internet, people, at least in America, were pretty much accepting of people on the street with cameras.
Thank you. Well, maybe we can all ask that question of Martin when he gives his Lowell lecture. I had one question, Karl, and that is that there are a number of series that Martin has done that are represented in our exhibition. Do you have the sense that these are finished series, or might Martin continue to add to them in the future?
Okay. Another question for the Lowell lecture. But my sense of, seeing his work over the past really 50 years is that he may not be done with all of them or any of them. I mean, if we go through it, he may not be done with the Irish pictures. Okay. I mean, he's based in the UK. He knows Ireland very well. he, I think, the last resort, he certainly made a coherent statement there, but there's nothing to say that he wouldn't go back to New Brighton. Perhaps the one as a group, as a specific group and a book that he is finished with is The Cost of Living. I don't think that he can add to that specific book, but the ideas in that book, the ideas about class, about economy, about what happens when people get money, about how people try to show themselves as moneyed, and how the people who really are moneyed don't show themselves at all, and aspiration, all that stuff. I mean, I think that has become a leitmotif for him. Small World, I think that if he can, he continues to travel. And auto portraits, sure, why not? As long as the photographers come up with new ideas and Photoshop comes up with new ways of presenting them, I think as long as he keeps it from being boring. And frankly, I think Martin also embraces boring, which is a whole nother chapter that I didn't have time to get into in this talk.
Well, Karl, I think it remains for me to thank you on behalf of all of us who've been listening today for the last hour and a half for this wonderful, engaging introduction to Martin's work and to the exhibition. And to say to all of our viewers that we hope to welcome you to the exhibition in the coming months, either in person or virtually. So until then, take care to stay well. And on behalf of Boston College and all of us at the McMullen, I thank you for your support and for joining us this afternoon.
Yes, please go see the show. I have to say that looking at these slides is nothing compared to going up to the prints, some of which are very large. And when you go up there, you can just see relationship after relationship. It's really, really rewarding. So thanks. And thanks, Nancy.
Thank you, Karl and Rachel, for organizing all of this. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.